The road asked me a question. The moment of realization came not with thunder or lightning or any sudden dramatic shift in the external environment, but rather as a kind of quiet settling into awareness, a gradual recognition that something outside of myself was attempting to communicate with me through means that transcended conventional language. I was driving on a highway that I had traveled countless times before, a route that connected my home to my workplace, a stretch of asphalt that I had traversed with such frequency that it had become something like an extension of my own body, a space that I navigated with the kind of automatic attention that allows the conscious mind to wander into thought while the body continues to perform its practiced movements. It was on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn when the first indication of something unusual occurred. I was driving through a section of the highway that I had always found particularly unremarkable, a stretch that passed through relatively flat terrain with sparse vegetation and no distinctive landmarks to break the monotony of the landscape. The road itself was in good condition, freshly paved with clear lane markings and smooth asphalt that made for an easy drive. I had been listening to a podcast, a rambling discussion about philosophy and the nature of consciousness, and I was only partially attending to the content while the larger part of my awareness was occupied with work-related thoughts and the various concerns and preoccupations that characterize the mental landscape of ordinary existence. I became aware of a peculiar sensation, a kind of subtle pressure or a tension that seemed to originate from the road itself, from the surface that my vehicle was traveling across. It was not a physical sensation exactly, not something that I could attribute to an irregularity in the asphalt or to some mechanical issue with my car. It was more like a quality of presence, a sense that something was directing its attention toward me, that I was being observed or considered in some way by something that existed in or through the road itself. At first, I attempted to dismiss the sensation as a product of my own imagination, as a kind of psychological artifact, generated by a mind that was simultaneously engaged with the podcast and with work-related concerns and with the general undercurrent of anxiety that seemed to characterize my existence. But the sensation did not diminish or fade as I continued to drive. Instead, it seemed to intensify, to become more insistent, more impossible to ignore or rationalize away. I found myself becoming increasingly aware of the road, of the specific characteristics of the surface that I was traveling across, of the way that the pavement extended forward into the distance and backward behind me, creating a kind of ribbon of surface that connected me to places I had been and places I would arrive at. The road seemed to possess a kind of presence, a kind of agency that suggested it was more than simply a physical structure designed for the transportation of vehicles. I began to notice patterns in the road surface that I had never consciously registered before, variations in the coloration of the asphalt, subtle alterations in the texture, subtle shifts in the way that the light reflected off the pavement at different angles. These patterns seemed to suggest something, seemed to be communicating information that my mind struggled to interpret. It was as though the road was speaking a language that I had once known but had forgotten, a language that operated through visual and tactile information rather than through the conventional medium of sound and symbol. I slowed my vehicle, attempting to pay more careful attention to what I was perceiving, attempting to understand what the road might be trying to communicate. As I reduced my speed, the sensation of attention from the road intensified. It was no longer simply a vague sense of presence, but had transformed into something more definite, more insistent. I could feel the question that the road was asking, though I could not yet articulate what that question was in terms of conventional language. The question seemed to exist at a level below words, at a level of fundamental meaning and implication that transcended the symbolic systems that I ordinarily use to make sense of reality. I pulled my vehicle over to the side of the road and turned off the engine, sitting in silence and attempting to understand what was happening to me. The sensation of the road's attention remained, even though I was no longer moving, even though I was no longer in direct contact with the surface of the asphalt. It was as though the road had established some kind of connection with me, some kind of channel of communication that was not dependent on physical contact or conventional sensory input. I sat with this sensation for several minutes, attempting to quiet my mind, attempting to make myself receptive to whatever the road was trying to communicate. And then, quite suddenly, the question became clear. It was not a question that was asked in words, but rather a question that existed as a fundamental shift in my perception of reality. A question about who I was and what I was doing with my life. A question about the choices I had made and the paths I had not taken. A question about the authenticity of the existence that I was living. The road was asking me whether I was actually living my own life, or whether I was simply traveling along a predetermined path. Whether I was making genuine choices, or whether I was following a route that had been established by others. Whether I was moving towards something that was genuinely mine, or whether I was simply moving because movement was what was expected of me. The intensity of the question was overwhelming. It seemed to cut through all of the careful rationalizations and justifications that I had constructed to explain my choices and my life trajectory. It seemed to suggest that much of what I had been doing, much of the effort and energy that I had been investing in my career and my relationships and my various projects and pursuits, was ultimately in service of goals that were not truly mine, that I had internalized as my own, but that had actually originated in the expectations and demands of others. I sat in my vehicle on the side of the highway for an extended period of time, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind struggling to process the implications of what the road had asked. Other vehicles passed occasionally, and I was aware that my stationary vehicle might appear unusual or concerning to other drivers, but I could not bring myself to move, could not bring myself to restart the engine and continue along the route that I had been traveling. The question that the road had asked seemed to demand a response, seemed to require that I do something, that I make some kind of change or decision, that I address the fundamental challenge that the question posed to the way I had been living. I began to think about the specific route that I was on, the highway that connected my home to my workplace, the space that I traversed 5 days a week in service of a job that paid my bills but that did not engage my genuine interests or passions. I thought about how I had ended up in this particular job, how the decisions that had led to my current employment had seemed reasonable and practical at the time, but that in retrospect seemed to have been made without genuine conviction about what I actually wanted from my life. I thought about the various relationships that I had invested in, relationships that had seemed important to me, but that upon reflection seemed to be based on habit and convenience rather than on genuine connection and shared values. The road was asking me to confront the ways in which I had been living inauthentically, the ways in which I had been traveling along a path that had been predetermined for me rather than creating a path that was genuinely mine. And the question was not simply an intellectual question, not simply a matter of thinking about whether I was living authentically. The question was a demand, a challenge, an insistence that I either acknowledge the reality of what the road was pointing out to me, or that I continue to live in denial about the fundamental character of my existence. I restarted my vehicle and drove back toward my home, my mind racing with the implications of what I had experienced. I did not return to work that day, nor did I attempt to contact my employer to explain my absence. Instead, I drove directly to my apartment and spent the evening sitting in my living room, attempting to process what had happened and what the road had asked. The question seemed to hang in the air around me, seemed to permeate the space of my apartment, seemed to suggest that nothing in my life could remain unchanged after having been asked in such a direct and undeniable way. Over the following days, the question that the road had asked continued to occupy my consciousness. I found myself unable to engage in ordinary activities in the way that I had before. When I attempted to go to work, I found that the job that had previously seemed acceptable, if unremarkable, now felt like an active violation of something, a betrayal of myself in service of goals that I did not genuinely care about. When I interacted with people in my life, I found myself increasingly aware of the ways that I was performing a version of myself rather than expressing my authentic thoughts and feelings. The question that the road had asked seemed to be spreading outward into every area of my existence, contaminating the comfortable structures and arrangements that I had constructed to organize my life. I made the decision to take a leave of absence from my job, telling my supervisor that I was experiencing some personal difficulties that required me to step away for a period of time. The supervisor was sympathetic but clearly puzzled by the vagueness of my explanation, and I could sense his confusion about what kind of personal difficulties could require someone to simply abandon their employment without more specific information. But I found that I could not articulate to him what was actually happening, that the question that the road had asked did not translate easily into conventional language, that it was a question that could only be understood and addressed through direct experience, rather than through explanation. I began to spend time driving on various roads, attempting to understand what the initial road had asked and whether other roads might be asking similar questions. I drove through rural areas and urban streets, traveled on highways and small back roads, attempting to sense whether there was a quality of communication present in these other surfaces, whether other roads might be engaging with me in the way that the first road had done. And indeed, as I paid more attention, as I became more sensitized to the subtle ways that the road might be communicating, I began to notice that every road seemed to be asking a question, though the questions varied depending on the specific characteristic of the road and the environment through which it passed. The rural roads asked quieter questions about simplicity and directness, and the possibility of slowing down enough to perceive what was actually present in a given moment. The urban streets asked more urgent questions about connection and community, and the ways that individual lives intersected with the lives of others in complex networks of mutual dependence and influence. The highways asked questions about direction and purpose, and the tension between destination and journey, between arriving somewhere and actually being somewhere. I began to keep a journal in which I attempted to document these experiences, to record the specific questions that different roads seemed to be asking. But I found that the moment I attempted to translate the questions into language, the questions seemed to lose their power and their specificity. The language that I used to capture them in writing felt like a pale shadow of the actual communication that was occurring, a reduction of something multidimensional and dynamic into a two-dimensional symbolic system that could never adequately represent what I was actually experiencing. Over weeks and months of driving and attempting to engage with the questions that the roads were asking, I began to develop a theory about what was actually happening. It seemed to me that the roads themselves were not, strictly speaking, asking questions in the way that one person might ask another person a question. Rather, the roads were providing a kind of mirror, or reflecting surface through which I could see my own patterns and assumptions and the ways that my life was organized. The road was not an external intelligence posing questions to me. Instead, the road was a manifestation of an aspect of my own consciousness that was attempting to communicate with the more ordinary and habitual parts of my mind. According to this theory, the reason that the questions felt so powerful and so undeniable was precisely because they were arising from within myself, from a level of my own consciousness that had access to truth about my existence that my ordinary waking mind tended to suppress or deny. The road was not asking me a question that came from outside of me. It was asking me a question that I was asking myself at a level of consciousness that operated beneath my ordinary awareness, a level that could not be easily accessed through conventional thinking or analysis, but that could be contacted through the kind of open and receptive attention that I had brought to the experience of driving. This understanding was both reassuring and deeply unsettling. On one hand, it suggested that I was not experiencing some kind of supernatural phenomenon or evidence of a mental health crisis. The questions were real, the communication was real, but it was originating from within my own consciousness rather than from some external source. On the other hand, this understanding also suggested that I could not escape the questions by simply attributing them to an external phenomenon and then choosing to ignore them. The questions would continue to arise because they were arising from within myself, from aspects of myself that seemed to be determined to make me acknowledge truths about my existence that I had been avoiding. I spent a period of time attempting to resist the questions, attempting to return to my previous patterns of life, and to simply ignore the communication that was occurring through my interaction with roads. I returned to my job, attempted to re-establish some of the relationships that had been disrupted by my extended leave of absence, attempted to return to the ordinary functioning that had characterized my life before the road had asked its question, but the resistance proved impossible to maintain. Every time I drove, the questions would return with renewed force. Every road seemed to be insisting that I acknowledge what I was being asked, that I stop pretending that I could continue to live in the same way. Eventually, I made the decision to stop resisting the questions and to instead attempt to understand what kinds of changes in my life might be required in order to answer them authentically. This process involved a systematic examination of every major area of my life, my career, my relationships, my living situation, my habits and routines, my values and priorities. For each area, I attempted to identify whether I was engaging with it because it genuinely expressed who I was and what I cared about, or whether I was engaging with it because it was what was expected of me, or what seemed practical, or what I had defaulted into without making conscious choices. The process was both liberating and profoundly destabilizing. Many of the structures and arrangements that I had constructed my life around began to seem hollow and inadequate when examined through the lens of authenticity and genuine choice. The career that I had built seemed to represent a kind of surrender of my own interests and passions in service of economic security and social respectability. The relationships that I had invested in seemed to be characterized by a kind of surface-level connection that did not engage with the deeper aspects of who I actually was. The living situation that I had accepted as normal and unremarkable seemed to be designed more for the convenience of others than for my own genuine comfort or expression. I began to make changes, slowly and carefully, attempting to align my life more directly with what I actually cared about and what seemed authentic to me. I left my job and began to explore alternative forms of that engaged with my genuine interests and that seemed to serve purposes that I could genuinely believe in. I ended relationships that had become more obligatory than genuine, and I began to invest more deeply in connections with people who seemed to share my values and my interests. I changed my living situation, moved to a different neighborhood that seemed to better express the kind of life I wanted to live. Each change created disruption and uncertainty, created challenges and difficulties that would not have existed if I had simply continued to follow the paths that had already been established. But alongside the disruption came a kind of increasing aliveness, a sense that I was gradually becoming more present in my own life, more engaged with the actual choices that I was making, rather than simply performing the roles that I had been assigned. And as I made these changes and as my life became progressively more aligned with what I actually cared about, the intensity of the questions that the roads were asking began to diminish, not because the roads stopped asking them, but because I was gradually answering them through the way that I was living. The roads had asked me whether I was living authentically, and by progressively aligning my life with my genuine values and interests, I was providing an answer to that question. Months passed, and I found myself settling into a way of living that looked quite different from the way I had been living before the road first asked its question. I was engaged in work that felt meaningful to me, even though it provided less financial security and less social status than my previous employment. I was spending time with people who seemed to genuinely understand me and with whom I could be more authentic in my interactions. I was living in a way that seemed to express my actual values and priorities rather than values and priorities that had been imposed upon me. And I found that when I was moving along roads in my vehicle, the experience had transformed. The roads no longer seemed to be insistently demanding that I acknowledge fundamental truths about my existence. Instead, they seemed to offer a kind of peaceful presence, a kind of companionship in the act of traveling from one place to another. The roads seemed to acknowledge that I was making an effort to answer the question that they had asked, that I was engaged in a process of creating a life that was more authentic and more genuinely mine. One afternoon, approximately a year after the initial experience on the highway, I found myself driving on the exact same stretch of road, where I had first become aware of the road asking its question. I pulled over in approximately the same location and sat in my vehicle, attempting to consciously re-engage with the experience that had first catalyzed all of the changes in my life. And I became aware, with a kind of quiet certainty, That the road had asked its question not in order to condemn me or to make me feel ashamed about the ways I had been living, but rather to offer me an opportunity to wake up, to become conscious of the choices I was making, to align my existence more directly with what I actually cared about. The road had asked me a question, and in asking that question, it had offered me a gift, the gift of consciousness about my own life and my own agency in creating the conditions of my existence. The question had been difficult and challenging, had required me to make changes that created disruption and uncertainty. But the changes had also made my life more livable, more authentic, more genuinely mine. I began to understand that roads, highways, the surfaces that we travel across every day could be understood as a kind of teaching tool, a way that consciousness or reality could communicate with us about the nature of our lives and our choices. Every road that we travel on is asking us something, is inviting us to pay attention to whether we are moving along it by choice or by default, whether we are traveling towards something that is genuinely ours, or whether we are simply following a path that has been established by others. The road had asked me a question, and in struggling to answer that question, I had learned something profound about myself and about the nature of human existence. I had learned that authenticity is not something that can be achieved once and then maintained indefinitely, but rather something that requires constant attention and conscious choice. I had learned that the expectations and demands of society are powerful and pervasive, that it is easy to surrender to them and to construct a life that is organized around meeting those expectations, rather than around expressing who we actually are. And I had learned that it is possible to resist those pressures, to make changes, to create a life that is more genuinely ours, but that doing so requires a kind of courage and a willingness to accept uncertainty and the disruption that comes from moving in new directions. Years have passed since that initial encounter with the road and its question. The specific changes that I made in response to that question have been superseded by other changes, other evolutions in how I understand myself and what I care about. But the fundamental understanding that the roads had catalyzed has remained constant. Every road that I travel on is still asking me whether I am living authentically, whether I am making conscious choices about the directions my life takes, whether I am aligned with what I actually care about, or whether I am surrendering to pressures and expectations that are not genuinely mine. The road asked me a ques, and in struggling to answer that question, I became more fully myself. The road is still asking me that question, with every journey that I take, with every path that I travel, and I have learned to listen to those questions, to honor them, to let them guide me toward a way of living that is more authentic and more genuinely mine. The road is a teacher, a mirror, a guide that is always available if we are willing to pay attention to what it is asking, if we are willing to listen to the questions that the surfaces beneath us are posing about the nature of our lives and our choices. The road asked me a question, continued, as I continued to live with the question that the road had posed. I began to recognize that the experience had opened a door within my consciousness that could not be closed, a door that revealed dimensions of reality and of my own existence that I could never again pretend were not there. The question was not something that I could answer once and then move forward from as though the problem had been solved. Instead, the question seemed to deepen and evolve as I continued to engage with it, taking on new dimensions and new implications as I progressed through the various phases of my transformation. The second phase of my engagement with the question began when I started to pay attention not only to the roads themselves, but to the ways that other people seemed to be responding to the same kinds of questions that I was responding to. I began to notice that many of the changes I was making in my life were creating a kind of ripple effect that was affecting the people around me, that my increasing authenticity and my progressive alignment with my genuine values was somehow triggering responses in others, creating situations in which people seemed to be forced to confront their own questions about authenticity and genuine choice. This recognition came first through the reactions of people who had been close to me before my transformation began. Friends who had known me for years seemed to respond to the changes in my personality and behavior with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Some seemed pleased by what they perceived as my increasing authenticity and engagement with life. Others seemed unsettled or even threatened by the changes. as though my increasing authenticity was somehow questioning the authenticity of their own lives, as though my willingness to acknowledge and act on my genuine desires and values was implicitly criticizing their choice to organize their lives around the expectations of others. I began to notice that when I spoke with these people about my experiences, when I attempted to describe what had happened to me and what I had learned through my interaction with the road and its question, many of them seemed to recognize something in what I was saying, seemed to be triggered by the possibility that they too might be living inauthentic lives, that they too might be following paths that had been established by others rather than by their own genuine choices. But many of them seemed to respond to this recognition with resistance, seemed to find ways to dismiss or minimize the importance of the question, seemed to suggest that authenticity was less important than stability or financial security or the maintenance of existing relationships and social structures. I watched people that I cared about construct elaborate justifications for why they could not make changes in their own lives even if they wanted to, why they had to continue in jobs that did not engage them or relationships that had become hollow, why they had to maintain patterns of behavior and choices that did not reflect their genuine values and interests. And I began to understand that the resistance to the question was not simply a matter of people being lazy or unmotivated or lacking in courage, though all of these factors certainly played a role. The resistance to the question was also rooted in a kind of existential fear, a fear of the uncertainty and disruption that would be created if they actually began to align their lives with their genuine values, rather than with the expectations and demands of their social environment. The road had asked me a question that seemed to suggest that authenticity was possible, that it was possible to live in a way that was more genuine and more true to oneself. But the road's question also implied something far more radical and far more challenging. It implied that the structures and arrangements that organized most people's lives, the jobs and relationships and living situations and social commitments that people accepted as normal and inevitable, were in fact choices that people had made, either consciously or unconsciously, and that those choices could be different if people were willing to acknowledge their agency and their responsibility in creating the conditions of their existence. This recognition produced in me a kind of compassion for the people around me, a sense of understanding about why they resisted the question that had been posed to me. The question was not something that anyone in their ordinary consciousness wanted to face, because facing it required acknowledging that much of what one had constructed one's life around was based on choices that were not genuinely one's own. It required acknowledging a kind of complicity in one's own inauthenticity, a responsibility for the ways that one had allowed oneself to be shaped by the expectations and demands of others. In this phase of my engagement with the question, I began to seek out people who seemed to be consciously engaging with similar questions, people who had made the decision to resist the pressures toward conformity and to attempt to create lives that were more aligned with their genuine values and interests. I found myself gravitating toward communities and groups of people who were engaged in various forms of alternative living and working arrangements, who were attempting to create spaces and structures that operated according to different principles than those that govern the mainstream society. What I discovered in these communities was that the question that the road had asked me was not unique to me, that it was something that many people seemed to be grappling with in one form or another. Some people described experiences very similar to my own, experiences in which some aspect of reality or consciousness seemed to be asking them fundamental questions about authenticity and genuine choice. Others described their engagement with the question as a more intellectual or philosophical process, a matter of thinking deeply about the nature of their lives and consciously choosing to align their behavior with their values. Still others described their engagement with the question as a spiritual practice or a religious commitment, a way of attempting to honor a higher principle or a deeper truth about human existence. What all of these different approaches seemed to share was a recognition that the ordinary structures and arrangements that organize mainstream society are not necessarily the only possible ways of organizing human life, that it is possible to create alternative arrangements that operate according to different principles and that serve different values. And what all of these different approaches also seemed to recognize was that making such changes required a kind of courage and a willingness to accept uncertainty, to move away from the safety of the known and established into territory that was less clearly defined and less socially validated. As I spent more time in these communities and with these groups of people, I began to develop a deeper understanding of what the road had been asking when it posed its question. The question was not simply a personal question about whether I was living authentically. The question was also a social question, a question about the nature of the structures and systems that organized human society, about whether those structures were serving genuinely human values or whether they had become ends in themselves, pursuing their own logic and momentum regardless of whether they actually served the well-being of the people who were organized within them. The roads that I traveled on were asking me whether I was moving along them because I genuinely wanted to move in that direction, or whether I was moving along them because they were the established pathways, because to move in a different direction would require more effort and would encounter more resistance. And this question was true not only of the literal roads that I traveled on in my vehicle, but also of the metaphorical roads that I traveled on through my life. The established pathways of career and relationships and social engagement that structured my existence. In this deeper understanding, I began to recognize that the question the road had asked was not something that could be answered once and then left behind. Instead, the question seemed to be something that required constant attention and constant re-engagement. As I made changes in one area of my life, the question would seem to arise again in another area, suggesting that there were other ways, that I was still moving along established pathways without genuine conscious choice, other ways that I was still allowing the expectations and demands of others to structure my existence. This recognition produced in me a kind of weariness at times, a sea, that there was no final resolution to the question, no point at which I could declare that I had successfully answered it and could then rest. But alongside the weariness came a kind of liberation, a sense that the constant engagement with the question was actually what authenticity required, that authenticity was not a state that could be achieved and then maintained, but rather a constant practice of paying attention to whether my choices were genuinely mine, a constant willingness to examine the structures of my life and to ask whether they were serving values that I genuinely cared about. I began to notice that the roads themselves seemed to be changing as I continued to engage with the question that they posed. Or rather, the roads themselves probably had not changed, but my perception of them and my relationship to them had transformed. Where I had once seen roads simply as surfaces that connected one location to another, as means to practical ends of getting from one place to another, I now began to see roads as kind of records of collective choices, as manifestations of the ways that human beings had decided to organize their movements and their interactions across space. Every road represented a particular organization of space and movement that reflected choices that had been made, sometimes centuries ago, about what connections were important, about where people should be able to move, about what kinds of relationships and interactions were valued. The highways that had been constructed through rural areas in the mid-20th century represented choices about the primacy of automobile transportation and the connection of dispersed populations through mechanized movement. The urban streets that had been designed and redesigned over centuries represented evolving choices about how people should live together, about the proper relationships between public and private space, about how different populations should be integrated or separated. When I drove on these roads, when I physically moved my body across these surfaces that were themselves products of collective choices, I was participating in those choices. I was either affirming them by moving in the ways that the road seemed to invite me to move, or I was resisting them by finding alternative routes, by walking instead of driving, by choosing to move across space in ways that were not prescribed by the infrastructure that had been established. The roads question was not only asking whether my personal choices were authentic, but it was also inviting me to consider the larger question of whether the structures and systems that I was moving within were systems that I actually wanted to participate in, whether they were aligned with values that I genuinely cared about. This deeper understanding led me to make more radical changes in how I moved through the world and how I organized my life. I began to experiment with driving less, with walking and cycling more, with moving through space in ways that were less dependent on the infrastructure of highways and automobiles. I began to seek out smaller roads and back routes, ways of moving through the landscape that seemed to offer more connection to the actual place I was moving through, that seemed to honor the particular characteristics of the terrain and the community in ways that the highways, with their generic design and their focus on speed and efficiency, did not. I also began to recognize that the question the road was asking was connected to larger questions about the kind of society that I wanted to live in, about what kinds of choices and arrangements would actually support human flourishing rather than simply serving the logic of economic efficiency and technological progress. I began to engage more consciously with questions about environmental sustainability and the ways that the infrastructure of modern society, the highways and automobiles and sprawling development patterns, were connected to environmental degradation and the destruction of ecosystems and community. In this phase of my engagement with the question, I began to feel a kind of expansion of my sense of responsibility. The question was no longer simply about whether my individual life was authentic, but it was now about what role I could play in creating structures and systems that would support authenticity and genuine human flourishing for others. How I could participate in the creation of alternative ways of organizing society that operated according to different principles. This recognition led me into various forms of community organizing and activism, into efforts to build alternative institutions and structures that could serve as examples and experiments in different ways of organizing human life. I became involved in efforts to create community gardens and local food systems, to support public transportation initiatives that would reduce dependence on automobiles, to develop housing arrangements that prioritized community and connection over isolation and privacy. I worked on projects aimed at creating spaces in which people could gather and interact in ways that were not mediated by commodity exchange or the logic of the marketplace. Through all of this work, the question that the road had asked continued to reverberate and evolve. What emerged was a kind of understanding that authenticity was not simply a personal matter, not simply about whether an individual was living in a way that aligned with their genuine values. Authenticity was also a collective matter, a question of whether the structures and systems that organized human society were organized in ways that supported authentic human interaction and genuine community, or whether they were organized in ways that produced alienation and fragmentation. The roads continued to ask their question, but now I understood the question in a more nuanced way. The roads were asking whether I was moving along them as a conscious agent, as someone who had genuinely chosen to participate in the systems and structures that the roads represented, or whether I was simply moving along them by default, because they were there, because they were the established pathways, because it seemed easier to follow the established route than to question whether that route was actually aligned with my genuine values and my vision of how human society should be organized. As years passed and as my engagement with these questions deepened, I began to experience a kind of integration in my understanding. What had initially seemed like separate questions about personal authenticity, questions about social organization, questions about environmental sustainability, questions about the kind of future that humanity was creating through the choices that were being made, began to seem like different facets of a single fundamental question about the kind of life and the kind of world that we wanted to create. The roads question was revealing itself to be a question about meaning and purpose at the deepest level, a question about what it meant to be human, about what values were worth organizing our lives around, about what kind of world we wanted to create for ourselves and for future generations. And this question could not be answered through individual transformation alone, though individual transformation was certainly part of the answer. The question could only be genuinely answered through a collective transformation, through the development of new structures and systems that could support more authentic and more genuine form of human interaction and community. In this phase of my journey, I began to meet and work with other people who had been asked similar questions by roads or by other aspects of their experience, people who had undergone similar awakenings and who were engaged in similar efforts to transform both their own lives and the larger structures of society. We began to recognize that we were part of a larger movement, a larger transformation that was occurring in consciousness about what was possible and what was worth striving for. We began to understand that the question that had been posed to me individually was also being posed collectively to humanity as a whole, an invitation and a challenge to awaken to our own agency and our own power to create alternative structures and systems. What emerged from this recognition was a sense that the Rhodes question was not unique to me, that it was a universal question that was being posed to humanity in various ways and through various means, that the fundamental question about authenticity and genuine choice was something that all human beings were grappling with in one form or another, whether they consciously acknowledged it or not. Some people seemed to be consciously engaging with the question, making deliberate efforts to transform their lives and to participate in the creation of alternative structures. Others seemed to be resisting the question, attempting to maintain the existing systems even as those systems were creating increasing amounts of suffering and dysfunction. The tension between these two responses seemed to be one of the defining characteristics of our historical moment. There was a kind of collision occurring between systems and structures that were based on principles of domination and efficiency and unlimited growth, and alternative movements and visions that were based on principles of sustainability and community and genuine human flourishing. The Rhodes question seemed to be inviting me to take a side in this collision, to consciously choose to participate in the creation of alternatives rather than to passively accept the continuation of the existing systems. But as I engaged more deeply with this recognition, I began to understand that the question was even more complex and more challenging than this simple binary might suggest. The question was not only asking whether I would participate in the creation of alternatives, but it was also asking something more fundamental, whether I could genuinely commit to alternatives without replicating the same patterns of domination and control that characterized the systems I was trying to move away from. Whether I could create new structures that were truly based on principles of authenticity and genuine human flourishing, or whether the new structures would simply be new forms of the same fundamental patterns, dressed in different language and aesthetics but operating according to the same underlying logic. This question pushed me into a kind of permanent state of vigilance and questioning about the work that I was doing and the communities and structures that I was helping to create. It meant constantly examining whether the alternative structures I was helping to build were genuinely serving authentic human values, or whether they had begun to reproduce the same patterns of hierarchy and control and alienation that they were meant to transcend. It meant accepting that the process of creating authentic alternatives was not a project that could be completed, not a problem that could be solved once and then left behind, but rather an ongoing practice of attention and re-examination and willingness to change direction when the structures I had created began to show signs of replicating the patterns they were meant to overcome. The Rhodes question had invited me not only into a personal transformation, but into a lifelong engagement with the fundamental questions about how human beings could live together authentically, how systems and structures could be created that truly served human flourishing rather than serving the interests of domination and control. The question was not something that would ever be fully answered, but it was something that seemed worth dedicating my life to engaging with, something that seemed to offer a kind of meaning and purpose that was absent from the ordinary structures of the mainstream world. Years continued to pass, and I found myself in a position quite different from the one I had occupied when I first pulled over on the side of the highway and encountered the Rhodes question. I had left my conventional job and my conventional life behind. I was living in a community-based setting, working on projects aimed at creating alternative structures and systems, spending my time in ways that felt aligned with my genuine values, even though they provided less economic security and less social status than the conventional path would have offered. The roads that I traveled on still asked their questions, but the questions had evolved. They were no longer primarily asking whether I was living authentically, though that question still arose at times when I was tempted to fall back into old patterns. Now they seemed to be asking more complex questions about the structures I was helping to create, about whether the alternatives I was participating in were genuinely serving the values I cared about, or whether they had begun to reproduce the patterns of the systems they were meant to transcend. And I began to recognize that the road's question, in its deepest form, was not a question that was asking me to do something or to create something or to change something. The question was fundamentally inviting me into a state of continuous attention and awareness, a way of moving through the world in which I was constantly examining the structures and systems that organized existence, constantly questioning whether those structures and systems were aligned with genuine values and genuine human flourishing. The road had asked me a question, and in asking that question, it had set me on a path of transformation that had no final destination, no point at which I could say that I had arrived at an answer and could now rest. Instead, the question had invited me into a way of being that was characterized by continuous engagement with fundamental questions about authenticity and meaning, and the kind of world that was worth creating. And while this way of being brought challenges and uncertainties, and the loss of the comfort that comes from simply accepting the established structures, it also brought a kind of aliveness and meaning that I could not have discovered through simply continuing along the predetermined pathways. The roads continue to ask their questions, and I continue to listen to those questions and to allow them to guide my movement through the world. The specific forms of my engagement with the question have evolved and changed, and they will continue to evolve as circumstances change and as my understanding deepens. But the fundamental recognition that the road had given me, the recognition that I had agency and choice in how I organized my life and what structures I participated in creating, has remained constant and has served as a kind of North Star guiding my journey. The road asked me a question, and I spent years attempting to answer it. What I came to understand is that the answer is not something that can be stated and then completed, but rather something that must be lived out through continuous engagement with the fundamental questions about what it means to be human and how human beings can live together in authentic and genuine ways. The road continues to ask its question with every journey that I take, and I continue to listen and to allow the question to guide my choices and my actions and the way I participate in the world.